Hello, my name is Matthew Cummings, and this is my presentation on transgender, environmental, and cultural factors. I need to quickly apologize. I may be coughing throughout this presentation. I've had a nasty cold for last week and it's not going away, and I apologize. But moving into it, so a brief overview of some health concerns is there are still ongoing social and legal issues that significantly isolate and discriminate the transgender community. With that, there are exceptionally high rates of suicide and suicide attempts, especially among the youth. A recent study found 34.6% of high school trans students had attempted suicide in the last 12 months. And that's actual attempts, not suicidal ideations. There's also a uh, tendency towards high risk behaviors, such as having multiple sex partners, unprotected sex, and illicit drug use, as well as there's inadequate provider competency in the healthcare field. So we have made strides towards being more inclusive, but there still is some disconnect between our trans patients and how we interact with them. So, cultural environment, the media, there has been increase in representation in mainstream media, especially in about the last 10 or 15 years, both with actors and actresses that are playing parts and as well as parts that are depicting trans members. But a recent study, semi-recent, it was back in 2012, found that only about 12% of screen time depictions were considered positive. They cast the transgender community in a positive light. The remaining were either negative or neutral. With that, trans actors and actresses are becoming more accepted in mainstream casting. A prominent one is Laverne Cox. She's a trans woman who played in Orange is the New Black, and she was actually nominated for an Emmy. On the plus side is both excuse me, both these depictions and the actors provide exposure to the general population of transgender people and the transgender community. So this increases the awareness of issues and needs that are going on. It gives people who may never have knowingly interacted with a transgender person exposure to that community. For family support is critical for trans individuals, especially during transition and early age. Many studies found that later life transitions and the older that trans members got, family support was less critical as they developed different different ways to cope and to sustain themselves. But the lack of support, especially among youth, was tied to high levels of depression as well as suicide. So individuals that had high family support, coupled with high levels of self-compassion, were able to transition very effectively. They were able to drop their old name, they call it their dead name, and they were able to assume a new name and their identity that they feel that they had been for their entire life. And they generally indicated to having much higher levels of happiness and outcomes. So the medical community, some of our best options that we have is to advocate for increased family support. Sometimes that's through therapy and counseling, but getting that family support through that transition time is critical to the well-being of the trans person as well as the family unit. If that's not possible, studies have found that the more trans people are able to have self-compassion and self-awareness, the better they're able to deal with that lack of family support. And it doesn't counteract it completely, but it does help them have better outcomes than if they were not able to have self-compassion and self-love. So the role of peers, is linked with family support. They often go hand in hand. But high levels of support in one does not necessarily prevent difficulties or issues in the other. So, if there is poor peer support, if friends in the community that a person socializes with, if they don't lend support, it often leads to the transgender person internalizing, going going within themselves, withdrawing, becoming isolated, and that leads to depression and then suicidal ideation. So, but conversely, positive peer support results in much better outcomes, some resiliency. But they did find in a number of studies that if there is still negative family support, peer support is often not very effective. It isn't quite able to counterbalance that negative family support, unfortunately. So the cyclic nature of this community, transgender people they've always existed, they've always been there, and there's always been ebbs and flows of acceptance and discrimination, just like with other minorities and identifying groups. An example is Jack Garland, born in 1869 in San Francisco as Elvira Margareta. Sorry if I said that wrong. But he actually ended up transitioning and became known as Uncle Jack. He was kind of a runaway celebrity, and he even helped the U.S. military. He traveled with them to the Philippines and acted as a translator. And he's one of our more known early examples of a successful, famous trans individual. More recently, in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw a backlash against the trans community as they attempted to assert themselves a little bit more, to tell the the world that hey, we're here and we're queer and we're not gonna go away as you have it. But there was some significant backlash. But the 2000s, especially the 2010s, have seen a steady increase of acceptance, both socially and legally, of a person's gender identity. So, legal and political issues. There is a confusing mix of state and federal laws, especially state to state. Um, some protections have been legally framed, although it's kind of had to be in a roundabout way, such as the 19th Amendment, which banned discrimination on the basis of sex. There was a 1989 case of Waterhouse versus Hopkins, which said that sex-based discrimination can still occur despite stereotypes. So if a woman looks like a man, that is still illegal to discriminate against that woman. And the 2015, I'm going to say this wrong, Obergefell versus Hodges, which established that sex status is not applicable for marriage. It doesn't matter what your sex status. So that's, although not transgender specific, it did have the secondary effect of allowing transgender people to have the right of getting married to who they wanted to get married to. So, unfortunately, though, some states have recently introduced or passed laws that roll back rights or directly challenge federal protections, such as Florida's Don't Say Gay or Trans law. It's a very prominent example right now. There's a lot of frustration with that law, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with it and see if it um, passes or stays in effect with the challenges that are sure to come to it. So, some potential barriers. So, social and legal biases are probably the greatest factors that lead to increased health disparity, medical issues, harm, and loss of life in the transgender community. It really is that social stigma, that lack of legal protections that just drives many transgender people to isolation and depression and suicide. Following up quickly behind that is that body dysmorphia, hormones, treatment regimens, and surgeries. It's all a very complicated process that really affects every facet of the transgender's life, their physical, their mental, their emotional well-being, their interactions, their friendships, their families. It's a very dynamic process that they have to deal with. There's also religious barriers. They often constrain the role of family support, so some family members may feel like they want to support that transgender individual, but because of their religious beliefs or the religious um, counseling that they're receiving, they're not able to do so. Um, And then older populations tend to be more reluctant to accept the trans status, while the younger population is much more accepting. And there's actually some signs and some studies indicating that that divide is quite significant. The younger population does not seem to care that much about a person's status. So, with the international scope, a general trend, and this isn't all inclusive, but a general trend is that Western countries are more accepting and support both socially and legally. Whereas religiously dominated countries, specifically Muslim dominated countries, are less willing to accept trans rights and they offer little protections. Worldwide, trans people they haven't achieved the same level of rights and protections as cisgendered, even in many of those Western countries. Although we are moving in the right direction in many of these countries. So, some health disparities. Our socioeconomic status. Based on the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, they found between a study that looked at the years between 2014 and 2017, they had 2,100 individuals identified as transgender. Um, Among those, and they didn't give specific numbers, but they said most of those respondents were not college educated. Almost all had significantly lower employment and income than their cisgender counterparts. And almost all of those individuals reported being very high in poverty and having much worse self reported healthcare status. So that is not good. Um, so, race and ethnicity, when coupled, so transgender people already have their biases that they have to deal with. But when they're combined with multiple minority characteristics, it's compounded. They have much more stress, they have lower health, and they have higher disparities than even other transgender individuals. Um, However, all transgender people reported levels of discrimination and other common issues. So it's not like um, uh, anybody that was transgender was free and clear from any of those biases. So those that had multiple minority characteristics just reported having more extreme experiences and versions of what was going on. It just seemed that the more minority characteristics that a person had, the more compounded their experiences seemed to be. For religion, so back in the 1960s, we saw the culture wars really started to go into full swing. Major religions became concerned with things like abortion and school prayer, and they saw themselves as the stalwart of traditional American values somehow. Um, Today, religious liberty and transgender rights have been incorporated into this culture war. They've brought those issues on board, and just as they are with abortion and other progressive ideologies, they're fighting against transgender. So that movement is often referred to as the New Christian Right. It's very conservative, and it is very much against the protections and rights for all peoples. Um, Surprisingly, this study that Castle wrote back in 2019 found that 2 out of every 5 Americans have a polarized view of transgender rights, which means they seem to uh, have their views in line with this new Christian right as far as transgender status. So, gender, obviously, gender is an issue with the transgender community. But there is significant health disparity between trans and cisgender people. A lot of it has to do with mental health and suicide, as well as hormone therapy and other gender affirming therapies. There's a lack of support for transgender status and unique needs in many hospitals, clinics, schools, and other public spaces. Now, we have been getting a lot better. Many intake forms have preferred names, many schools have preferred names, but we are still identifying people on their birth markers. We're still, our paperwork may not all be up to date on preferred names, and sometimes we do, they call it dead naming them, where we call them by their birth name after their transition, and it is quite traumatic for some of them who have been through some significant things to let go of that name and transition over. So with that geographical location within the U.S., uh, there is a significant difference from state to state. I was very surprised. If you look up one reference that I have up here, I would go look up this Goldenberg study from 2020. It's massive and it was in depth, and it looked at every state and had such a wealth of information. I could spend an hour on it. But generally, the West Coast and New England area in the U.S. have the most progressive, inclusive laws, rights, and policies. I think California was the very top. And then generally, the southern and middle swaths of the U.S., to include Florida, have the least protections and have the highest barriers to carry the nation. And we see most of the discrimination policies coming out of that geographical area. Surprisingly, outside of Medicaid, federal policies and influences was considered pretty limited as far as healthcare was concerned. Um, the state's position was the primary factor in effective healthcare, and that's because yes, the federal government funds Medicaid, but states have the right to, within constraints, to decide how that funding is allocated. And so some states don't allocate Medicaid for transgender issues, and then some states like California do allocate Medicaid funds for transgender issues. But outside of that funding issue, the federal government was pretty limited. It was really the states that was the driving power. So then some biases. So implicit biases. There is dissonance even amongst people who are well accepting and well versed of the transgender community when a person's biological features don't match their stated gender. It's not intentional. I don't think it's vindictive, but sometimes there is a little bit of dissonance as we try and reconcile when if a person looks biologically male but identifies as female, it takes a little while to process that. There is also a lot of unawareness of the issues of facing transgender people until my stepson came out to me as transgender. And then through this semester, I've been studying the transgender issues. I was very unaware of the issues that transgender people are facing. Um, and then there is a unintentional trend to not take into consideration the unique gender and biological needs that are associated with it. So, an example: a trans man goes in for medical care. Um, well, that trans man still may need like uterus care. They may need to be looked at for cervical cancer, things like that. So there is still those biological reproductive organs that need to be medically cared for, but we need to be cognizant of their gender identity and how we treat them. So then explicit biases, those laws, like that Florida law. Um, there are laws that explicitly bias against the transgender community, and there are laws that, by omission, that we just don't have them, don't protect the rights of the transgender community. There's also religious dogma that discriminatizes and antagonizes against the transgender community. There is a lot of religious trains of thoughts that really are anti-transgender. And then rigid family and social structures that are unwilling to accept difference seems to be a pretty big trend. So the international scope, so the World Health Organization, it's the leading world body of health, is lagging behind many of its member nations in disease classifications. It Up until 2019, it was using the term transsexual, which is offensive and not used. It has been used for a couple decades to transgender. Western nations, again, are more progressive and inclusive, and Muslim nations and third world countries are least accepting. But overall, just as in the US, there seems to be a slow, gradual trend towards acceptance and introducing protection of rights and trying to equalize access to health care and, um, and take care of our transgender members. So these are my references. There's quite a few. Um, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention. I hope that we can all do a little bit better towards all of the human race and our transgender members. Take care. Bye.